Greetings, Mandrake Road. This week we continue with our study on Sabbath, and last week we introduced the Sabbath commandment from the Ten Commandments in Exodus, and we see that again in Deuteronomy 5. But one of the reasons I think Sabbath is such an important topic right now is rest is not something that we tend to really consider. Sleep we recognize as being important, but I think the idea of what rest is meant to be, and as far as Sabbath is concerned, is something that I'm hoping we're going to unpack over the next several weeks. And so I hope that these are enlightening and enjoyable and help challenge us to think about what it means to rest and reflect on what Sabbath is. And so today we're actually going to be talking about something that we don't talk about very often from Scripture, is what we call a Sabbath year, and how this relates to the idea of Sabbath, not just the idea and practice of Sabbath. And eventually we'll get to some questions related to, well, are we supposed to practice the Sabbath and all of that, but that's a little ways down the road. And so right now I want to unpack what is Sabbath. This is meant to kind of give us an introduction to Sabbath. And so today there are two texts that we'll be looking at, and then we'll look at some practices, and I'll share my own experience with attempting to practice Sabbath over the past year or so. So our two texts today are from Exodus 23, 10-11, and Leviticus 25, 1-7, which I'll go ahead and read. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. And now the Leviticus text. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Sabbath for the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in their yield. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest to the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. You may eat what the land yields during its Sabbath, you, your male and female slaves, your hired and your bound laborers who live with you, for your livestock also, and for the wild animals in your land, all its yield shall be for food. So when I read this text, my first thought is, imagine being told to cease your livelihood that not only produces income, but it might be the only way you and your family are able to eat. In ancient agrarian societies, farming societies, subsistence farming was common, and it's still common in many places today around the world. In the Exodus and Leviticus text, we hear God command Israel to observe a Sabbath year, every 7th year. So it brings to mind why. There are some practical reasons for leaving farmland empty, or fallow as the text says. Farmers, whether commercial or practicing subsistence, are aware that you can overfarm land. Soil that you grow crops in requires nutrients. And I worked on a farm for a number of years, and we had a rotation where we would grow certain things in fields for a certain amount of time, and then we would give it a year off. And we would follow up certain crops with different crops, because it would produce, it would put different nutrients into the soil. And just like we require rest, land and particularly soil, in the case of farming, requires nutrients. And rest is a necessary part of that. And so over farming, so the question is, what happens if you over farm land? Well, over-farming land can render it unusable and upwards of hundreds of years if on the extreme end. And the only way for it to become usable again is to be farmable again is to let it rest. It has to repair itself. And so there are some practical reasons for a Sabbath year, but it also there's an element here of faith or trust in Yahweh to provide the Israelites as He has promised provision in the land, that as long as they are faithful, that God will remain faithful to them and the land will produce for them. This idea is reflected in God's requirements for the Sabbath in Numbers, when He tells the Israelites to take only what they need and double the day before the Sabbath. And when they take too much, it spoils. And in this case, Sabbath requires radical trust in God, that He will provide despite not tending to the land. And this is something that I struggle with. I struggle with just thinking about not, quote unquote, tending to the land. When I first began practicing Sabbath, I would brood over the work I wasn't accomplishing and plan for all the work I would make up the following day. I found that it was much more difficult than I anticipated to actually practice Sabbath. My mind was constantly on work, on the idea that I was not producing something, whether that was for school or for the sake of Mandrake, whatever that was. And after several months of practicing Sabbath, I actually still struggle with this. I still have a hard time letting go of that. I've been unlearning this habit, one that I have been conditioned to practice over the years. And so Sabbath, in fact, requires a bit of unlearning. Because the world calls us to be slaves, to endlessly pursue work and wealth, which we have several cute phrases for. We've heard the phrase "time is money," or "I'll sleep when I'm dead." So we hear of people who only sleep a few hours a night, and there are several others. Those are just two of the ones that many of us will be familiar with. And it calls us to what God has called us to. That yes, work is good, but in balance with the rest that I have called you to rest and reflect on the good world that I have created. And so, what kind of practices can we do to kind of, one, practice this unlearning, and to kind of do our best to not be producing or not give into the need to produce. First, make sure to do all of your daily chores the night before if you're practicing an entire Sabbath day. So dishes, laundry, that type of thing, get that done. Don't let that sit there. It's hard to just let that go, at least for me anyway. Don't set a schedule. This one's really hard for me. I love to schedule my days and make plans for each day. Sleep until your body wakes up, or take a nap. This is something that many people, taking naps doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, but I tend to resist that. And we all struggle if you work a full 8, 10, 12 hours a day, whatever that looks like. About mid-afternoon, it's hard to stay awake at times. And so that carries on. Even on my days off, I don't normally take naps. Allow yourself to be present in the moment. What does this mean? So when I take Jilly for walks, if it's during a day where I'm working, I'm less inclined to let her just sit and sniff. She, since we've had her, she will pull in all directions to find something to sniff. She will sniff everything. And so I have, on my Sabbath day, I let her take as much time as she wants. When she's ready to go, she can move on to the next thing, even if that means just sniffing, 3 inches away from where she was just sniffing, which is a lot more common than I expected. When you pray without expectations. I have a list that I go through when I pray each day, or I have a person in mind. But sometimes, especially on Sabbath, I just enter into conversation with God and let it just kind of pour out. I let it. It's unplanned and unfocused. Last, and this is one that we will do, that I'll mention every video, is grace. Give yourself lots of grace. Practicing Sabbath is something that will be, even if it's just for part of one day, an hour or two, it can be very difficult to allow yourself to rest. And that's because many of us have grown up with this idea that if you're not working, you're not producing, or you're not consuming, then you're failing or you're lazy. And that is not necessarily what this looks like. And Sabbath is something where rest is demonstrated as necessary and important for us, for the land, for creation in general. And so, as we think about Sabbath, I want us to think about what it looks like to practice Sabbath. And so, as I've shared, if there are things that if you are trying to practice Sabbath, if there are things, especially during this time when we're kind of being forced into Sabbath, where we can't just go to the office at any time, or we have to stay home, and those of us who are working from home, it can be hard to just kind of stop. And so practicing Sabbath is something that's going to take time and being intentional. And so as we go through this process, if you have practices that you are doing or trying, share them. Let me know, let other folks at Mandrake know exactly how you are practicing Sabbath. So with that, I will close, and next week we will move on from a little bit of the introductory kind of things, and we'll be getting into some more specifics about how we see Sabbath functioning in Scripture. And so I invite you to join us. And again, this week, Cliff, Thad, and Colleen will be leading our discussions. And this week I will not be leading a discussion on Friday, but I will be sending more out about that. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we will see you throughout the week.